It's called the Flamingo case.
Mm-hmm.
And it involves a former government minister who's trying to, make a political comeback.
It's a fascinating case, a fascinating situation, to say the least. We've got a pile of news articles from Aruban outlets to go through.
Yeah.
And even a court statement.
Oh, wow.
So, let's get to it.
So think of us as your guides to this, complex case. We're going to break down the accusations, the evidence, and what this could all mean for Aruba, all without getting bogged down in legal jargon.
Right, because understanding the context is key here. You see, we're talking about Otmar Oduber, who was Aruba's Minister of Spatial Development, Infrastructure, and Environment from 2017 to 2019.
Wow.
He's currently running for office with the Partido Patriótico de Aruba.
And that's where things get, really interesting, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to win back the public's trust while fighting some pretty serious accusations.
Exactly. We're talking about allegations of omkoping, that's bribery, oplichting, which covers both fraud and embezzlement.
Wow.
And misbruk van functie, meaning abuse of power. All this stems from his time as a minister.
So if he's no longer a minister, why is all this coming up now, years later?
Well, that's the thing about corruption investigations. They can take time. This one, nicknamed Flamingo, was launched back in 2019.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't until 2022 that we saw arrests, including Oduber himself, who spent 10 days in pretrial detention.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. What does pretrial detention even mean? Is that like being in jail before you've even been found guilty?
It is. But it's not a given in every case. In Aruba's legal system, a judge can decide to hold someone before their trial if they believe there's a risk the person might flee, tamper with evidence, or commit further crimes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So the fact that Oduber spent time in pretrial detention suggests the authorities must have had some serious concerns.
Absolutely. And this is where the accusations of systemic corruption come into play.
Sure.
The prosecution isn't just alleging isolated incidents.
Yeah.
They're arguing that Oduber was at the center of a scheme that involved using his influence to benefit friends and acquaintances through government contracts and land deals.
So instead of just saying like, hey, this land is going to the person who offers the best proposal, it was more like, this land is going to my buddy, regardless of whether they're the best fit.
That's the gist of it, and this is where understanding Aruba's political and economic landscape is really important.
Okay.
Land is a valuable commodity on a small island.
Right.
And government contracts can be quite lucrative, so the stakes are high.
Okay, so we've got Oduber at the heart of this alleged, web of corruption. But he's not alone, right?
Yeah.
There were others implicated, like Isaac Esser, Oduber's former right-hand man.
Right. Esser is accused of being deeply involved in the bribery and abuse of power and faces up to 18 months in prison if convicted.
Wow.
Then there's Oduber's own son, Jendrik Oduber.
Wait, his son is involved too.
Yeah.
That's like a whole other layer of complexity.
It is. Jendrik is facing allegations of fraudulent practices and could be fined 25,000 florins and sentenced to 180 hours of community service.
Jeez.
It's important to remember, though, that both Esser and Jendrik are presumed innocent until proven guilty.
Of course. But it does make you wonder about the family dynamics at play here. Did they know what was going on? Did they benefit from it? We'll have to wait and see how that all unfolds.
Indeed. And then there's the curious case of the ghost employees.
Okay.
People who were allegedly on the government payroll but not actually working.
Ghost employees. That sounds straight out of a spooky story.
Well, it's certainly unsettling.
Yeah.
One example is Laurent Phillips. He's facing a potential 6-month prison sentence for his alleged involvement.
So, if Phillips was getting paid by the government but not working, where was he? What was he doing instead?
That's one of the questions the prosecution is aiming to answer. They're likely trying to establish a link between Phillips's absence from his official duties and any potential benefits he might have received, possibly through Oduber's influence.
It sounds like they're trying to piece together a puzzle, connecting the dots between these individuals and the alleged corruption scheme.
Exactly. And then there's another ghost employee, Hans J.P. German. What's interesting about him is that he was appointed as an operations manager, but was actually working as a radio presenter, promoting Oduber.
Wait a minute. So he was basically Oduber's radio hype man, paid for with government funds.
Yeah.
Isn't that a conflict of interest, even if it wasn't technically illegal?
That's a great point, and it speaks to the broader issue of ethical conduct in government. Even if something isn't strictly against the law, it can still raise questions about transparency and accountability. In German's case, he actually made a deal with the prosecution.
Oh, wow.
Agreeing to pay back over 125,000 florins in fines and restitution.
So he's admitting to some wrongdoing, which could potentially be used against Oduber in court, right?
Yeah.
It's like one domino falling and potentially setting off a chain reaction.
That's a good analogy. And then we have Richinella Weaver-Croes,
Okay.
a former government employee accused of fraud and forgery.
Oh, geez.
She's facing a 6-month suspended prison sentence and 240 hours of community service.
Okay, so we've got a former minister, his right-hand man, his son, a couple of ghost employees, and a government worker accused of fraud. That's quite a cast of characters.
It is, and it gives you a sense of how wide-ranging this investigation has been. The prosecution seems to be building a case that suggests Oduber was at the center of a network of individuals who were either complicit in or benefiting from his alleged actions.
We've just scratched the surface of this tangled web, and already it's clear that this case is about more than just like individual misdeeds.
Yeah.
It raises questions about how power is wielded, how resources are allocated, how far people might go to protect their own interests.
Exactly. And that's why the prosecution is pushing this idea of systemic corruption.
Right.
They're trying to demonstrate that Oduber's alleged actions weren't just isolated incidents, but rather a pattern of behavior, a way of doing business that benefited a select few at the expense of the public good.
Okay, so how are they actually proving this systemic part? What kind of evidence are they bringing to the table?
Well, remember those ghost employees we talked about?
Yeah.
They're a key piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
The prosecution is arguing that these individuals were receiving government salaries without actually performing any work. This suggests a misuse of public funds, which strengthens their argument about a broader pattern of corruption.
So it's not just about whether Oduber personally pocketed any money. It's about whether he used his position to funnel funds to people who were loyal to him, regardless of whether they were actually serving the people of Aruba.
Precisely. And this is where the case of Hans J.P. Grumman becomes particularly relevant. Remember, he was appointed as an operations manager, but actually spent his time working as a radio presenter promoting Oduber.
Right. The radio hype man. Even if that wasn't technically illegal, it still looks pretty shady, right?
Absolutely. It raises serious questions about Oduber's judgment and his commitment to using public funds responsibly. The prosecution is likely to argue that German's appointment was a clear example of favoritism and a misuse of taxpayer money.
And the fact that German cut a deal with the prosecution, agreeing to pay back those fines, that doesn't really help Oduber's case, does it?
Not at all. It suggests that German is acknowledging some level of wrongdoing, which could bolster the prosecution's argument that there was indeed a culture of corruption within Oduber's ministry.
Okay, so we've got the ghost employees, the alleged favoritism, the misuse of public funds. What else is the prosecution focusing on?
They're also placing a lot of emphasis on the damage this alleged corruption has done to public trust. They're arguing that Oduber's actions have eroded faith in the government's integrity. They're saying, look, if people believe that the system is rigged, that connections matter more than merit, then why should they participate? Why should they trust those in power?
That's a really important point. It's about more than just legal violations. It's about the long-term impact on Aruba's society and its democratic institutions.
Exactly. The prosecution is trying to frame this case as a matter of principle, a battle to uphold the values of fairness, transparency, and accountability.
So it's a pretty compelling case, at least on the surface.
Yeah.
But what about Oduber's defense? How are they responding to all of this?
Well, his lawyer, Vito Carlo, is a seasoned attorney.
Yeah?
And he's coming out swinging. He's challenging the prosecution's case on several fronts. First, he's arguing that the investigation itself was flawed, riddled with procedural irregularities.
So he's saying that the prosecution didn't follow the rules, that they might have cut corners or overstepped their boundaries.
That's the gist of it. He's claiming that these irregularities have tainted the entire case.
Yeah.
And he's asking the judge to throw it out.
Wow, that's a bold move. But if he can actually prove these irregularities, it could really damage the prosecution's case, couldn't it?
Absolutely. It could create reasonable doubt in the judge's mind, which could lead to a dismissal of the charges or a weakening of the prosecution's position.
So it's a high-stakes legal battle, with both sides fighting hard. What specific irregularities is Carlo pointing to? What exactly is he claiming the prosecution did wrong?
Unfortunately, our sources don't provide those specific details. Legal proceedings can be quite opaque. And the specifics of Carlo's arguments might be buried in court documents that haven't been made public.
That's frustrating, but understandable. I guess we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out in court.
Exactly. But beyond the procedural arguments, Carlo is also making a broader claim about the prosecution's motives.
Okay, what's he saying?
He's alleging that the prosecution is engaged in an abuse of power, that they're targeting Oduber for political reasons, not because he actually committed any crimes.
So it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, suggesting that there's some, hidden agenda at play.
It's certainly a bold claim, and one that's likely to be met with skepticism by some, but it's a tactic that defense lawyers often use, especially in high-profile cases. They try to shift the focus away from their client's alleged actions and onto the motivations of those bringing the charges.
So it becomes a question of who to believe. Who has the more credible story? It's like a legal drama unfolding in real time, with the fate of a political career hanging in the balance.
That's a great way to put it. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a pivotal election in Aruba.
Right, with Oduber still very much in the running. So how does this legal battle, with its accusations and counter-accusations, impact the upcoming election?
Well, it creates a highly charged atmosphere, to say the least. Voters are left wondering who to trust, who's telling the truth, and what it all means for the future of their island.
It must be incredibly difficult for voters to make an informed decision with all this uncertainty swirling around. They're being asked to weigh the allegations against Oduber's experience and his potential to lead.
Exactly. It's a complex situation, and there are no easy answers. On one hand, you have the presumption of innocence, a fundamental principle of our legal system. Oduber is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
But on the other hand, you have these serious accusations, backed up by an investigation that's been going on for years. It's hard to ignore that, even if you want to give Oduber the benefit of the doubt.
Right, and that's the dilemma voters are facing. Do they prioritize a candidate's experience, even with these allegations hanging over his head? Or do they opt for someone with a cleaner record, but potentially less expertise?
It's a tough choice, and it highlights the importance of an informed electorate. Voters need access to reliable information and a clear understanding of the issues at stake.
Absolutely. And that's where things get even more interesting. This case isn't just about Oduber and his alleged actions. It's about the broader political landscape in Aruba, the potential for change, and the challenges facing a small island nation grappling with complex issues.
It feels like we're, witnessing a real-life political drama. With the stakes incredibly high, we've got a former minister battling corruption charges while simultaneously trying to convince voters to give him another shot. And it all hinges on this upcoming court date, right?
Exactly. On November 20th, a judge will decide whether this case even goes to trial. Think of it like, like a preliminary hearing, like in those courtroom dramas you watch. The judge has to determine if the prosecution has enough evidence to proceed.
So if the judge sides with Oduber's lawyer, and dismisses the case, does that mean it's all over? Game over for the prosecution?
It wouldn't necessarily be game over. The prosecution could potentially appeal the judge's decision. Or they could go back and gather more evidence. Maybe try to build a stronger case against Oduber or some of the other individuals involved.
So even if Oduber clears this initial hurdle, he's not entirely in the clear. The legal cloud could linger for a while.
That's a good way to put it. And the political fallout could be significant, regardless of the legal outcome.